In the early years of the United States, the new government faced its first major test. It was not a war against another nation, but a rebellion within its own borders. This was the Whiskey Rebellion. After the American Revolution, the United States was deep in debt. To raise money, Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton proposed an excise tax on distilled spirits in 1791. Anyone who made or sold whiskey now owed money to the federal government. Hamilton believed the tax was fair and necessary to build credit and strengthen national authority. But many frontier farmers disagreed. Most lived in western Pennsylvania and nearby regions. For them, whiskey was more than a drink. It was currency. On the frontier, cash was scarce, and farmers turned grain into whiskey because it was easier to transport and trade. The tax required payment in hard money, which small farmers rarely had. Large eastern distillers could afford the annual fee, but smaller ones had to pay by the gallon. To many, it felt like a tax, favoring the rich and punishing the poor. Resistance grew quickly. Some farmers refused to register their stills. Others threatened federal tax collectors. Several collectors were assaulted, tarred and feathered, or driven from the area. In 1792, President George Washington issued a warning that the laws of the United States must be obeyed. Still, opposition continued. Meetings were held across the western counties where citizens compared the whiskey tax to British tyranny. By 1794, anger had turned to open revolt. In July, a U.S. Marshal arrived in western Pennsylvania to serve warrants to those who had not paid the tax. He was joined by General John Neville, the regional tax inspector. They were confronted by an armed group of farmers. Shots were fired, and one protester was killed. The next day, hundreds of men surrounded Neville's home near Pittsburgh and burned it to the ground. News of the violence spread quickly. Rumors circulated that rebels planned to seize Pittsburgh or break away from the Union entirely. Washington saw the uprising as a direct challenge to the Constitution and the authority of the federal government. He first tried negotiation, but when that failed, he decided to act. On August 7, 1794, Washington issued a proclamation ordering the rebels to disperse. When they refused, he called up a federal militia force. More than 13,000 troops from several states assembled, the largest army Washington had commanded since the Revolution. He personally reviewed the soldiers before placing them under the command of General Henry Lee. It remains the only time a sitting U.S. president has led troops in the field. As the army marched west, resistance collapsed. The sight of such a large federal force convinced most rebels to return home. There were no major battles. About 150 men were arrested, but only 2 were convicted of treason, and both were later pardoned by President Washington. The show of strength worked. The rebellion ended without further bloodshed. The Whiskey Rebellion proved that the new federal government had the power and will to enforce its laws. It also revealed deep tensions between Eastern elites and Western farmers. To supporters of Washington and Hamilton, the outcome showed that order and unity could be maintained. To critics like Thomas Jefferson, it proved that the government could become too powerful and quick to use force against its own citizens. The whiskey tax remained unpopular and difficult to collect. When Jefferson became president in 1801, he repealed it entirely. Though brief, the Whiskey Rebellion was a defining moment in early American history. It tested whether the young republic could survive internal division. It showed that peaceful protest was a right, but armed resistance to federal law would not be tolerated. Washington's response set an important precedent that the government must enforce its laws firmly, yet show restraint once order is restored. By pardoning the convicted rebels, he demonstrated both strength and mercy. The rebellion's legacy lived on in the balance between liberty and authority, and in the growing divide between rural and urban America. From conflict came order, and from rebellion came stability. The Whiskey Rebellion, from 1791 to 1794, proved that the United States government was strong enough to stand, and that freedom must coexist with the rule of law.